What's up, everybody? Ben Rasa and Matt Gajewski here for Odd Chopper and for Betting You, and that means it's time to talk more college football. We begin our conference previews, and of course, got to start with the SEC. We're going to break down all the teams, all the bets to be made, and look at who is live to actually take down this conference. We got a lot to get to today, Matt. I'm not sure. I actually never really asked you this. I know you're a son of the Big Ten, as they say. What are your thoughts? Are you an SEC fan? Do you like that conference? Is it one you enjoy to bet?
Yeah, I love the SEC. There's kind of a tradition in the Gajewski household from when I was a kid. You watch the Badgers at 11 because we're in Central Time, and then you turn on Alabama at 2:30.
Yep.
And then from there, you just watch whatever Pac-12 that after dark game is on at night. So watch a lot of SEC football, particularly Alabama. So I'm excited to get into this.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're going to be talking about perennial national championship contenders with several teams here. And there's no doubt that this is the best conference in the country. They're just super conferences that are emerging. But for the right now, we still have a pretty normal slate of teams in the SEC. I will say real quick, if you're hopping in for the first time, checking out the channel, welcome aboard. Welcome to Odd Shopper. Hit the like button. Don't miss any of the content, whether it's college football previews, baseball games, PGA. That's why you want to subscribe. Just press the subscribe button. In a little bit, I'm going to tell you how to make some free money just for signing up over at BetMGM. I'll do that in a bit. But let's just dive into it. I'm ready if you are. And of course, I mean, we when we start most of our shows, no matter what episode it is, it's Alabama-centric, whether that's Bryce Young, whether that's national championship contenders, and whether that's an SEC preview. Alabama sits with 10.5 wins, and the over is massively juiced. They are minus money to win the SEC. Are these prices warranted?
I think they're warranted, but they're just really hard to bet, especially for a win total at 10.5, locking your money up for 6 months of the year. You really don't want to see like minus 225 towards the over, but there's really nowhere else to go with Alabama. There's a very real chance they go undefeated this year. I mean, you look at their losses last year, they outgained Texas A&M, and that loss ended up losing by 3. And then against Georgia in the title, there were some significant injury situations that I think hindered Alabama. Their roster is fantastic this year. Their coaching staff is entirely intact. You don't lose anybody there of importance. They bring in the number 2 recruiting class, and arguably the best signal caller in college football returns, Bryce Young. He was 3rd overall in passing grade at PFF last year, number 1 under pressure, and the number 1 overall quarterback, just looking across everything they grade. At running back, they bring in Jahmyr Gibbs, a solid transfer. And they lose a lot at receiver, which I think is the biggest question on offense. Mechie, Williams, and Bolden are gone, but they have some high-profile transfers. They weren't studs in their programs, but they were good in small samples. Like Jermaine Burton, he was a player that only participated in 50% of the routes, but he was extremely efficient. Georgia just crushed all their opponents. He didn't necessarily need to play the whole game. And Tyler Harrell, he's kind of that burner that comes over that should fill in for Jameson Williams, a Louisville transfer. Allegedly, he runs a sub 4.3 40-yard dash. We don't know that for sure without combine testing, but that should be very helpful. And even if he's not the same talent as a Jameson Williams, it gives you the chance to take the top off the defense and create big plays. So Alabama's strong, just really hard to bet.
Definitely hard to bet. I want to ask you one more thing about the personnel because you have all the info. That is why I do the show, so I don't have to watch it, but that is why people tune in. What about their offensive line? Obviously, they just reload. There's no doubt about it. But just looking at what I've seen from Alabama, they have suffered some losses on that front. Do you think that could be an issue? Could that be a pain point this year? Or does it not really matter with a team that's this loaded?
They were pretty strong last year. Just, I guess I should say above average. And they're a little unsettled. They returned 3 of their starters, Cohen, Delcourt, and Kyer. But they also got Tyler Steen from Vandy, who is kind of the crown jewel among the offensive line transfers. He's somebody that's been a strong starter for them in each of the past 2 years. And then they're always recruiting 4 and 5 stars. So I think they're only really replacing one position there. It wasn't the best unit last year, 77th in pass blocking, but those 3 starters that returned should get a little better with just year-over-year development. And Steen is a solid transfer. So I'm expecting them to be an above average unit. And if something happens with the receivers, they just can't play anywhere near the level that Williams and Mechie did. Expect them to run a lot with Jahmyr Gibbs, who comes over from Georgia Tech as a strong transfer at running back, who also is an amazing pass catcher himself. It's probably his best skill. He's only 200 pounds, but he has 59 receptions and over 750 receiving yards over the last 2 years as a pass catching back, which we know Alabama likes to use.
I'm with you. If you're gonna do something here, I don't know how you go under. It would have to be an over. I don't like this bet. It would be a pass for me. Last thing before we move to the next team, schedule wise, I don't see really anything notable. I expect them to breeze through non-conference, even with Texas, and then they get into the thick of their normal SEC West schedule.
Yeah, I mean, you draw Vandy from the East. That's nice. Tennessee's the other team they draw. See, it's a pretty easy schedule in terms of Alabama. You know they're going to run into the usual suspects in their side of the conference, but the crossover is not bad.
Hot take. I'm gonna give some hot takes today. If Alabama loses a game, it's gonna be to Tennessee. That's a weird game. They're coming off the Texas A&M game at home. That's gonna be a high pressure game with everything that happened in the offseason. And then they have to go to Knoxville right there. Tennessee's gonna be better. I have a feeling that'll be a sneaky game for Alabama, but I don't know if they lose to any of these teams, and we'll see what they're made of in the SEC championship. Anything else for the Crimson Tide?
I think we hit it all. Just touching on defense, it's pretty strong. I think it'll be better than last year, especially with Will Anderson. He could be like a top 5 pick.
Yes, don't bet him for the Heisman, but he's going to be very, very, very good. All right, let's stay in the West. You want to do it West, and then we'll go to the Georgia side after that?
Whatever you want to do, man.
We're going to run down the West because I want to kind of talk about how these teams coexist amongst each other. And one of them certainly is Ole Miss, who obviously Lane Kiffin has done a great job recruiting and making them relevant. 7.5 is their win total. Over's a little juice. I see it in the -135 range. Obviously a much bigger bet to win the SEC. You're talking upwards of 50-1. They bring in a transfer at quarterback. They lose Matt Corral, of course. Where does Ole Miss stand heading into the season?
They have mostly continuity in their coaching staff. Levy does leave as their OC, but that's not huge. Lane Kiffin's really driving the show there anyway. They're number 2 in the transfer portal, so very good class coming in. Their overall recruiting class is 24th, so we have some pretty good talent coming in, but a lot hinges on whatever Jackson Dart is going to give them, and they do have a quarterback battle on their hands. Luke Altmaier still not out of the running. Those are both 4 stars. Dart was kind of up and down when he played for USC last year, completed 62% of his passes, 9 touchdowns, and the 5 interceptions is really the problem. If he can kind of cut down on those turnovers, he should be fine in a Lane Kiffin-led offense. But, this offense kind of turned towards the run last year anyway. Their pass rate was actually a little lower than expected. They were 91st in pass rate, and you see them bring in 2 premier transfer backs. One, Zach Evans, former 5-star, who's just been an absolute monster with TCU. He's averaged over 7 yards per carry in both of his seasons there. He's going to be the bell cow. And then you have Ulysses Bentley coming over from SMU, who profiles more as a scat back, your receiving type back. And we know Lane Kiffin likes to use multiple backs. So getting them both in the picture is solid. Receivers kind of a question too. They lose some production, and what they return in Jonathan Mingo, he's never really been that productive. So he's a question mark. Jalen Robinson comes over from UCF. He's only 5'9", 180, but he's been incredibly productive down in the G5. So hopefully he can take the step up to the rigors of the SEC. And from there, you're looking at a bunch of rotational players like Jordan Watkins from Louisville. He's been efficient in small samples. Danish Jackson last year when he had to play was pretty efficient. Malik Heath comes over from Mississippi State. Not efficient whatsoever, but he's a veteran. And you get Michael Trigg from USC at tight end, who had a 3% target share last year, but he continues to receive hype based on his recruiting profile. We'll see if he can take the step forward. I do think their offensive line is fairly solid when you look at what they bring back. They were 40th last year, and they have a pretty good amount of returning production. And the production they do return was solid overall. But last thing here, I do think their defense is going to be significantly improved after they were pretty middling last year. A lot of the returning production is actually good. And again, another spot where they just hammered the transfer portal. They should have 3 starters coming over in the transfer portal with Peegs from Auburn, Troy Brown at linebacker, and then Hasheem Young in their secondary. I think the defense is actually going to be improved, which is not what we've really talked about with Ole Miss in previous seasons.
No doubt. They've had to outscore basically everybody. If they can get a little more balanced, that's going to go a long way. Bringing it back to the 7, and I don't think they're live to win the SEC, but I do think that they're going to win 8 or more games here. Non-con, Troy, Central, Arkansas, Georgia Tech, and Tulsa. To me, that's, 3-1 at the worst, but should be 4-0 right there. Then you get into it's tough. You get Kentucky and Vandy, though. You get Vandy from the East. You got to win a couple of SEC West games. I think they can do that.
I think so, too. Vandy is a fantastic draw. And I mean, you look at the bottom of this conference, like Mississippi State's not projected to be fantastic. You'd think that they're favored over Mississippi State. I think you're looking at minimum 6 wins. And then if you can knock off some of the middling teams, probably 7. Like Auburn's another team that's not really viewed in high regard in the SEC right now. So I think pretty easy 7. It's not one I want to bet when you're looking at an over of -135, though. I think if you were just projecting wins, it would be either 7 or 8 for this team. So there's not a ton of value.
Anything else? My last question before we move on, do you really care in terms of your position on who wins this QB battle? That's not going to impact much, is it?
It's tough to say because neither has really shown much. Altmaier hasn't played in his career. The only time we really saw him was when Corral went down. And Dart was so up and down, it's really hard to say. I don't think there's a clear front runner right now.
Moving on, we'll go to Arkansas. It's really interesting in the West. What we're going to find is it's Alabama, and then the second team in the West, I think, could be upwards of 3 or 4 teams, to be honest. And I'd say Arkansas has an outside shot to be that team. 60-1 to win the SEC. I don't think that's happening. Another 7.5 win total. But this is a team, there's no doubt, took a step forward. They have been building towards something, and last year they started to get real dividends. Jefferson at quarterback, really, really strong. I really like their coach. I'm a Kendall Briles fan as well. Talk to me about the Razorbacks.
Yeah, I love Briles. I like the continuity they'll have on offense. Returning their signal caller is huge. KJ Jefferson was fantastic last year. 6th highest graded quarterback in the SEC per PFF. And his efficiency numbers were awesome. 67% completion, 9.1 yards per attempt, only 4 interceptions, and then he's extremely mobile. The question for me with Jefferson is like, who is he going to throw to? Yeah. I think there's a chance this team just falls back on their offensive line, which is really strong. They have a very good offensive line. All of their returning players had fantastic PFF grades. I think there's a chance they're even run heavier with Jefferson. But when you're looking at the Burks replacement, I don't think there's a clear in-house guy. And then the transfers you land, like Jaden Haselwood, he's been a perennial underachiever with Oklahoma. And his efficiency actually was worse than I thought. Only a 16.5% target share for him. 1.2 yards per route run is well below the collegiate average. Matt Landers comes over from Toledo, but he's a guy that only had a 10% target share, incredibly efficient, but that's in the MAC. And then on their team already, you're looking at like Warren Thompson, Ketron Jackson. They do have 2 incoming 4-stars, which are probably the most intriguing players as far as the receiving game goes. Quincy McAdoo and Isaiah Satina. But man, looking at what they're going to have to do to replace Burks is a huge question. I think they're just going to ride Dominique Johnson, Raheem Sanders, and KJ Jefferson and only throw when necessary. And already last year, they were 122nd in pass rate. So I'm not expecting too many more passes from this offense overall.
They open with Cincinnati, a really interesting game there. They get South Carolina and Missouri from the east, at BYU in the middle. It's not the best schedule at A&M. They've got Bama, of course, at Auburn. I think they're going to be fine. I think they probably get to a bowl, but I'm not betting this. And if I did, it would be the under.
Me as well. They are only returning 4 starters on defense, too. They did hit the transfer portal really hard. Like, I am expecting 4 of their starters to come in via transfer. Jordan Dominic from LSU, Landon Jackson's another guy, Jordan Dominic from Georgia Tech, Landon Jackson from LSU. And then they have Dwight McGlothern and Drew Sanders. Sanders comes over from Alabama. But I mean, you're losing a lot of production here. I think you're really relying on, like 18th year senior Bumper Poole and then Jalen Catalan. I thought he might transfer, but he actually came back. He was an All-American in 2020, kind of took a step back last year. But if he can play to that All-American status that he did in 2020, their defense will be very good. It's just they kind of need to coalesce and develop rapport with so many of these players coming via the transfer portal.
No doubt about it. Bumper Pool, all-time, all-name team you got going for them. Worst team in the West. Let's get them out of the way. Mississippi State, 6.5 win total. The over is slightly juiced at -125. We know what they're going to do. They're 121 to win the SEC. You don't have to worry about that. This team is going to throw early and often. It's Mike Leach offense. I don't have much to say here. Will Rogers obviously is going to have big numbers, but is that going to translate into wins?
Will Rogers has been solid, but I think pretty unspectacular. Middling quarterback, doesn't run whatsoever, pure pocket passer. And defenses that face Mississippi State and Mike Leach know exactly what they're going to do. His yards per attempt was just 6.9, which isn't great. So you don't love that. But then you look at what they have around him. They're losing quite a bit of production, and I don't think they really have the guys to replace it. Jaquavius Marks and Dylan Johnson were both excellent receiving backs, but both horrifically inefficient on the ground when they were asked to run. Their wide receivers aren't great. Like, just looking at yards per route run, every single one of their projected starters is well below average in terms of yards per route run. Austin Williams 1.2, Jaden Wally 1.42, Jamar Calvin 0.75, and Lightich Griffin 1.3. Now, they do recruit Marquez Dortch, a four-star freshman, and have a couple players waiting in the wings that could step up. But this Mississippi State team likes to rotate their receivers, and they've struggled to evaluate their personnel in the past, just trying to find the most talented receivers. Without anyone really coming in of consequence, I'm not expecting this passing game to take a step forward. And then their offensive line loses some pretty solid players. That's headlined by Charles Cross, first-round draft pick. Scott Lashley is also gone. The players they do return are solid, but I still don't think you can play to that same level without Cross or Lashley there. So expecting their offense to take a little step back. And the same thing kind of goes for defense. They do return 9 starters, but some of the production they lose is really important here. I think when you look at replacing Martin Emerson, you have some players that received hype like a DeCameron Richardson or a DeCarlos Nicholson, but those players don't have a lot of experience. So I don't think this unit's going to be vastly different, but just a slight step back. And you look at their schedule, it is very difficult, especially considering their non-con and the crossover they have with the East.
That's the real problem. Schedule dictates a lot of this. They got Kentucky and Georgia from the other side. That's a big mistake. I also think there's a chance they start with Memphis and at Arizona that they could be 1-1 after those 2 games. If they are 1-1, this is going to hit the under. They don't have that many winnable games. They get 2 freebies in Bowling Green and ETSU. Other than that, I'm not sure where the wins come from. I got to go under. Someone in the SEC West is going to have a bad year, and it seems like it's them.
Yeah, I mean, this team played a lot of close games last year. Now we're expecting them to be a little worse. This team lost to Memphis in the opener last year. They lost to LSU by 3. They only beat Louisiana Tech by 1 point. They beat Auburn by single digits. Like, they were in a lot of really close games last year. Some they won, some they did not. I think you're likely looking at the same situation. And I do think their win total is pretty accurate, but if you're going to give me plus money on the under, this is actually one I want to bet. I'll take Mississippi State under 6.5 wins at plus 105 and just bet the pure value.
I'm with you. We are in line so far, no doubt about it. Now, if there's a challenger to Alabama in the West, I think most people would say that it's Texas A&M, not just because of the off-season chatter. They sit at 8.5 wins, minus 150 to the over. 18-1 to win the SEC. I want to talk about that. They're the first team that I think is at least worthy of that conversation. Obviously, a brutal schedule. How serious do you think the threat is from Texas A&M?
It is serious. They're number 1 in recruiting. They have a ton of high-profile players coming in. They didn't really hit the transfer portal, and I don't necessarily think they had to. This is a multi-year rebuild, especially with the level they're recruiting at now. But they still have significant questions. So when you look at the win total, 8.5, I would rather take them to win the SEC overall. That just means there's probably a chaotic situation, but you'll get paid off in the situation. Their win total, I'm not sure you do. It's sitting at 8.5, heavily juiced to the over, but there's a lot of questions for this team. And the first one is who plays quarterback. You have Haynes King and LSU transfer Max Johnson, neither of whom looked fantastic. Like, for reference, Max Johnson was the 11th highest graded passer in the SEC last year. That's not great. And he regressed in terms of his mobility, only 119 yards there. You look at the offensive line. They lost Kenyon Green and Jameer Johnson. Johnson wasn't a fantastic starter, but Kenyon Green is an NFL caliber player. And then the other players were solid run blockers, but actually pretty brutal in pass protection when you look at just their PFF numbers. Their defense only returns 5 starters. And because you're not hitting the transfer portal, you're really relying on these recruits to step up. Now, they have a ton of recruits. 15 players on defense are at least 4 stars or better. But again, that's a lot of really young players. And for a team like Texas A&M, you'd like to develop them a little bit in season. So I do think this is a team that could start out a little slow. Their non-con is relatively easy, not the easiest with Miami there. And then their crossover, I do like it against South Carolina and Florida, but just a team that needs a lot to go right very early in the young careers of this number 1 recruiting class. So for me, if I were betting it, it would be under plus 130. I think this is kind of like a fringe bet because I really do think the conference and the SEC West is difficult, and taking that kind of plus money makes sense. But overall, with this easy schedule, it's hard to see them falling completely flat. So that's kind of where I'm at with A&M.
Yeah, they're a tough evaluation. I will say the one nice thing for a team that probably does get better throughout the year, they open with 3 straight home games and they get a neutral site game. They don't hit the road till they go to Starkville in the 5th game of the year. That helps. That it's not like they have to go into a hostile environment immediately. They should be much better when they hit at Mississippi State, at Bama, at South Carolina. That's going to be the thick of that schedule there. So we will see. I don't really have a take on this team. I think it's pretty unlikely that they ultimately challenge Alabama. I don't think they'll be able to do that this year. In future years, who knows? I'm not going to really bet this, so I will stay away. We'll keep an eye on it, though. They're going to be a team that I probably look too short, depending on what that spread is in the Miami game. I'm really high on Miami this year. I think they can beat Texas A&M. Now, talked about – oh, so go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say they're really volatile. They play super slow and really run heavy, which makes sense given their team because, they're returning a decent amount of starters in the offensive line. But again, this offensive line was outside the top 100 in pass blocking. And now you're relying a lot on Devin Achane to just get it done, who is incredibly efficient, but he's only 185. I don't know if he can handle a full workload with Spiller now gone.
These are the questions, but all these bets, obviously the number one thing you want is a bankroll to do it. And if you want a little extra money for the bankroll, I talked about this earlier in the show, BetMGM is giving you $200 free for signing up over there. It's very, very simple. The link is in the description of this video. It is pinned to it. All you do, sign up at BetMGM, deposit $10 or more. You can do more if you want, or just $10. Take that money, bet it on any baseball game. I do a baseball bet every morning. You could steal my bet or just bet anyone because it doesn't matter if you win or lose. They give you $200 just for doing that. Sign up, deposit, bet a baseball game, $200. Take that money, have some fun with it. Take some chances that you wouldn't normally would at BetMGM. Great, great opportunity. We're almost through the SEC West. We got only a couple more teams, and I don't think that Auburn garners a ton of conversation. They're down there with Mississippi State for possibly the worst team in that division, 6.5, and the unders juiced pretty heavily at -160. Is it going to be that bad? Is losing Bo Nix that detrimental?
There's a lot of questions with Auburn. I actually like the under at -160. I already bet it. I think this should probably be at 5.5 instead. And the questions start really with the coaching staff, which you can't say about a lot of programs. But there was kind of like a mini exodus from Auburn this offseason after the Brian Harsin debacle. He decides to replace his coordinators with his old buddies from Boise State, Eric Kiesaw, who's going to be the OC, and Jeff Smeding, who is the former DC of Boise State. I don't like that he's not actually evaluating the coaching, talent pool that's on the free market. He's just hiring his friends. And it's already a team that's kind of just face planted since he took over, which is pretty crazy considering the coach that was there prior. Now, the questions at the skill positions, quarterback, you're looking at Texas A&M transfer Zach Calzada, who's actually a little better than expected. He was PFF's fifth highest graded quarterback in the SEC last year. Or TJ Finley, who had to play a little bit when Bo Nix got hurt, and he was very bad when doing so. Neither of these guys is mobile whatsoever. So you're looking at pure pocket passers behind an offensive line that has a ton of concerns. Last year, the offensive line was 49th. I think they're going to be worse this year. They lose Broderius Ham and the 4 starters they return. They are middling to above average. Keandre Jones is probably the best player here, but I'm not sure you can fall back on the run like a team maybe in Texas A&M's caliber. At running back, Tank Bigsby is back after he debated a transfer move. Bigsby had a down year, only 1,099 yards on 223 carries. When you look at his yards after contact and forced missed tackles per attempt, they were both below average. So you're going to hear a lot of people talking about Tank Bigsby as this future NFL runner. He's 6 feet, 208 pounds, but he was vastly outperformed by Jarquez Hunter, a guy that you and I talked a lot about last year who we thought should see more work. And that's the big problem. Hunter was better than Bigsby last year, and he deserved more work, but the coaching staff didn't give it to him. And I'm not confident that these coaches can evaluate the talent on their roster and figure out who the actual best players are. Then you go to defense, 6 starters return. There's some pretty questionable players here. The strength is certainly going to be their defensive line. And you do replace a little bit of talent in the secondary, but overall, I think this defense is going to take a step back as well. Auburn overall is a very difficult team to evaluate, and they're headed in the wrong direction, stemming from the coaching staff.
I look at this team. You mentioned the Tank Bigsby thing. That was a pain point all year last year. I'm not confident in the coaching staff. I'm not confident in the talent relative to what they're dealing with. They, I mean, when you're trying to get over 6.5 wins, it's okay to have a couple that seem very doubtful. They're at Georgia, they're at Bama, and they get a couple freebies. They got Mercer on the schedule, San Jose State. They go to Penn State. That's probably going to be one of the games that they have to win, and then they're going to have to win. I'd say one of, or not one, but probably two or three of these: LSU, at Ole Miss, Arkansas, at Mississippi State. Those are the type of games that you're going to have to see Auburn win to launch up into the upper half of the West. I don't really see it. I think there's more questions than answers. And to me, the other problem with Auburn, and you could disagree, I think a team like Texas A&M, even though I don't like them, there's a variance to them that they could be good. I really don't see the ceiling for this team. They might be okay, but it seems like the ceiling truly is like 8 wins.
When you look at the betting markets, and the betting markets tell us a lot, like the odds to win the SEC, Auburn is third to last. So, I mean, you look at the SEC schedule they play, they're going to be favored in one game if the season started today. That's against Missouri. So you have one game favored there. They're going to be dogs to Penn State. They're only favored in 4 games this year: Mercer, San Jose State, Missouri, and Western Kentucky. They're dogs in every other game. Their win total at 6.5 is just way too high. I mean, I think that says it all without even looking at their roster, which you and I have significant questions about.
Well said. It's true. They're going to be dogs in 8 games. I don't think that that's outrageous to think. And a team like Western Kentucky, I mean, we'll say they were throwing the ball all over the place last year. I don't think that kid's not back, is he? Zappy?
No, he was a UDFA in the NFL, and they lost Kitley. He's the OC at Texas A&M, or excuse me, Texas Tech now.
Tough scene, but it doesn't matter. You're going to have to find multiple. If you really are high on Auburn, honestly, you can cash probably more tickets week to week just by betting them with the points, or even taking them on some of these money lines until the books adjust, because they will be dogs in some of these games. The last team in the West, the normal rival to Alabama, is LSU. I was really high on LSU last year. I don't even know what we could say. They were ravaged by injury. The season just derailed very quickly. The UCLA game, amongst others. They have a flat 7 win total. The over is a slight dog at plus 115, 70-1 to win the SEC. What remains of them? Obviously, some of their big names are on rivals right now. When you think of Ricks and Co. and Max Johnson and some of those guys, what is left for LSU?
Their team completely getting rebuilt, and I think it starts with the coaching staff, with Brian Kelly coming over from Notre Dame. He's an excellent recruiter, and we see that immediately paying dividends now. Teams that are built through recruiting in the transfer portal, it's going to take them time, so I'm not expecting them to win the conference this year or even really challenge, but 12th in recruiting, 3rd in the portal. They're going to be more competitive than people think, and it starts with the quarterback. They got a high-profile transfer in Jaden Daniels, who was underutilized in a horrific Arizona State offense. He had an excellent PFF grade, 83.2 is well above average, and he's extremely mobile, so he can win in multiple ways. He also has a great cast around him. Kayshon Boutte did not transfer, and he returns coming off injury. He's a potential first-round draft pick at receiver, so you always love playing with that. And because of the injuries, Boutte was one of them. All these players behind him got a lot of experience, like Jack Beck. He played a lot last year. Jeray Jenkins, Brian Thomas, Malik Neighbors, and they had Kyron Lacey from Louisiana Lafayette. It's a very experienced receiving core for a team that is undergoing such changes, which I like here. And at running back, you are getting John Emery, presumably back. He was academically ineligible last year, but he's a former 5-star recruit, good size, 5'11", 220 pounds. I think he could handle a full workload, full bell cow workload. There's not a lot behind him. In the offensive line, they lost 4 starters, but they hit the transfer portal extremely hard. They have 2 part-time starters returning in Wire and Dellinger, but they have East Tennessee State transfer Tremont Shorts. He's transferring up. Luckily, he was an FCS All-American, so we're not talking about some just normal transfer here. Miles Frazier comes over from FIU. He's a player that was a freshman All-American, and he's played pretty well there as well. And the last starter will probably be some sort of recruit, like Will Campbell, I probably think is the favorite here, 4-star incoming. And defense is the exact same. They have so many transfers coming in that I don't think the fact that they're only returning 5 starters on defense is going to matter as much. And then you consider some of the guys they do return that weren't full-time starters, like an Ali Gay. They missed time because of injury. So I think this team is being under-projected in the SEC relative to some of the other teams we talked about.
Interesting schedule. Open up with Florida State. They get Florida and they get Tennessee from the East. It's not the best, kind of a mixed bag. There's definitely some easy gimmies in there. Southern, okay. New Mexico, why not? UAB. It's going to be like all these teams. They're going to have to hold their own in the West. They have to beat Mississippi State and they have to beat Auburn. We talked about this last year. This reminds me of the ACC, where we said all these teams are playing each other. A couple of them, I thought NC State, and I think that again, are going to have to knock these off. It turned out that Wake Forest was that team. Could LSU be that type of team?
I think they could. So here's why. Their non-con, I think you're looking at 4 games they're favored in, Florida State being the most difficult. I actually think Florida State's improved, but favored in those 4 games. They're better than Mississippi State and Auburn. Like LSU's plus 7,000 to win the SEC. Mississippi State is 12,000 and Auburn's 15,000. So that's going to be 2 other games they're favored in. And I think just if they knock off one other game here, one other team, you have a lot of potential push equity, especially in their crossover. Florida's there. They're a team I'm down on. Tennessee, they're actually not too different in terms of their odds to win the SEC. So if you were betting it, I think over 7 is probably where to go. But again, if I were going to make this win total myself, I would put it exactly at 7. So at least there's some push equity, but I don't think the under is good play.
Yeah, I mean, you've talked about those 6 games, and then I'll just read off the other 5 where they'd have to steal a couple. Home to Tennessee, at Florida, home to Ole Miss, home to Bama, and at Arkansas, at A&M. You know, they're going to be dogs in those type of games, but it's not going to be 20-point underdogs in all of them. They'll be, minus +5, +8, they can steal a couple of them, particularly, I think, Florida. And I don't think Arkansas is going to be that good. That could be a field goal type game. So I get it. If it was 6.5, this would be my favorite bet on the board. I think this lands directly on 7 a lot, which no damage if it does. But if you could get over 6.5, if you can shop this and find it, I would lay juice on 6.5 at the over.
For sure. And just for reference, those middling games you're talking about, the games against Tennessee, Florida, and Arkansas are going to be very close to pick'ems based on the current win totals and odds to win the SEC right now. So it's not like you're Auburn and you're playing some of these teams as significant underdogs.
Correct. And listen, in Death Valley at night, particularly, very, very difficult for teams to come in there. No doubt about it. All right. We're going to the other side. Here we go. We'll start where I normally would start with Kentucky, but I got to start with Georgia. Those are the rules. They're clearly, they're not a threat to Alabama. They're the champs. 10.5 win total, just like Alabama. Over is minus 230, basically like Alabama. Where do they stand? How likely are they to win the SEC? You're getting plus money at plus 155. It seems like they're way more likely to actually make the game, just given the East versus the West.
I agree with that. I would rather bet them to win the SEC at plus 155. I do think they are going to regress a little bit. The problem is all the other powers in the SEC East are also regressing, and the teams that are actually surging have a little ways to go. You're talking about like Tennessee improving, South Carolina improving, and Florida getting worse. I mean, it's like they don't really have a challenger in that side of the conference just yet. Maybe in a few years they will. But overall, I think you have to look at their defense first and foremost, only returning 3 starters. They do rotate a lot of players, so that is the positive here. These guys that weren't starters last year do have some experience, not to mention they absolutely crushed every single team they played. No margin of victory, under 10 points, except that debut against Clemson. So Georgia's defense does have more experience than maybe you would think. I do think on offense, you're going to rely a lot on this offensive line and just pounding the ball down teams' throats again. Stetson Bennett wasn't great. He was the SEC's 8th highest graded quarterback. And I think you do have a little bit of a Justin Fields situation where they have a room full of 4 and 5s behind him, Beck, Vandegrift, and Gunnar Stockton. But overall, I'm not sure they need to use it. I think the big question with Georgia is when they get to the college football playoff, do they have the horses to actually win a shootout against Bama and some of the other teams, Ohio State, that might be there? Overall, their offense, I think, is going to be very tight end centric, 12 personnel, run heavy. And that should be more than enough to get over the hump in the current schedule they're going to play. Very, very weak schedule overall.
They didn't need help. They draw Auburn and Mississippi State from the West. I mean, give me a
worst
break.
Teams.
Like, you couldn't craft a better situation for them with Auburn and Mississippi State. Non-con's not going to be a problem. They always end with Georgia Tech. that rivalry has gotten out of control in terms of lopsidedness. They get past Oregon, and I think they do. I honestly don't even know where this team loses. Their hardest stretch by far is at Florida versus Tennessee and at Kentucky. They will be significant favorite in all three of those games still.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. They just don't have a rival in the East.
No.
And we're going to talk a lot about the East win totals. I think it's going to set up very well for some of these teams.
Yeah, listen, Georgia, I think that certainly if I was going to lock up my money on an over 10.5, I would rather take the Georgia side than the Bama side. I don't think that even if Georgia stumbles once, I don't know how they lose 2 games with this schedule. So count me in for the over on Georgia. Don't even mind them at plus 155. The thing I don't love about that, they might be around that for that game if they get there, if Bama's undefeated. So it's like you took them pre-flop to get a similar line that I could take the week of the SEC championship potentially. So that's one thing about that. If they stumble, I guess Kentucky would be the biggest threat. 8 win total right on the number. Basically a toss-up, minus 115 to the over, minus 105 to the under. Definitely the team that I think we as a team made the most money on last year. They were a cash cow. I'm a huge Will Levis fan. You talked about Liam Cohen. This team is awesome. Obviously Wandell not there, but what remains for Kentucky?
They're replacing a lot. And Liam Cohen is gone. I believe he's back to the NFL ranks where he deservedly belongs. And then they're replacing him with Rich Scangarello, who I don't like. I mean, it's the polar opposite of what we saw last year coming in. Scangarello, he's basically a failure at every stop of the way. I think his most notable jobs in the NFL were the Broncos OC in 2019, not great. Eagles assistant. Like, he hasn't even had continuity with the teams he's been coaching for. So I don't like Rich Scangarello. And then Will Levis is losing his best option in Wandale. I don't really see a strong replacement for him. They had Tavian Robinson from Virginia Tech, but he's a guy that was below average in terms of yards per route run, and he's never been able to kind of get over that gadget guy label. All the other players that they had on offense for receiving weapons were just horrifically inefficient. Isaiah Cummings, DeMarcus Harris, well below average in terms of yards per route run. There's a chance the top 2 receivers for Kentucky are both true freshmen, 4-stars, Dane Key and Berrien Brown. Very, very inexperienced there. And then the offensive line loses 3 premier starters in Luke Fortner, Darian Kennard, and Dare Rosenthal. That's going to be tough for them to just fall back on the run like some of these other teams can. They're replacing a lot. And then not to mention their star running back was arrested for a DUI this offseason. Now, he might not miss a game. We don't have the consequences yet, but it's at least something to monitor. On defense, they're also losing a ton of production. They're only returning 5 starters here, some of whom are very good, like a JJ Weaver's excellent. You also have like DeAndre Square, very good player, but it's a lot of talent they're losing across the board. With a coaching staff coming in, primarily an OC coming in that I don't really like, and a conference schedule that's relatively difficult, I think this is a team that I might be looking towards the under.
That hurts my heart, but I can't really push back. I also don't like, I've talked about a lot of these teams that are maybe working in some new pieces. They open with 3 or 4 cupcakes and they don't hit the road. Kentucky gets at Florida in the second week. I don't like when teams do that. That's a big game. That's a swing game for this win total. And they are going to, they play Miami of Ohio to start. Then they go into the swamp. Yes, they should be 3-1 when the dust settles there potentially, but that's a win that if it was, or a game, if it was later in the season, I'd feel more confident in Kentucky.
Yeah. And I mean, they're close in terms of projection against teams like Tennessee and, Ole Miss. Some of these teams aren't on their schedule, but there's like a mid-range of the SEC where you have like 6 teams that are projected at plus 4,500 to plus 7,000. And I think those teams are just going to cannibalize each other. So with Kentucky sitting at a win total of 8.0, if they end up being the team that gets cannibalized a little bit, I think it's just a really high number to be looking to place a wager on.
There's no doubt. That's kind of, I was saying that about the West a little bit, and the ACC is like that. And we're going to do conference previews for all this. This is why you want to like and subscribe to this very channel. We are going to have plenty of college football, all the data as well, all the depth charts that Matt's created. We're going to put them on the site, be able to see them, because that's really where the information comes from. If it's not Kentucky, and I actually am with you, this is where we may disagree, though. Tennessee is at 7.5. They're another team in the East that's looking to take that next step. They're, as I mentioned, 7.5 win total. What do you see for the Volunteers this year?
I think Tennessee is a solid team to look at here. Now, their crossover is a little more difficult. You're drawing Bama, which is very difficult compared to some of the other teams that have easier crossover opponents. But Tennessee's win total 7.5. I like their roster a lot, and I like their head coach. Heupel's been excellent with this team, and he's developed them pretty well, and he did so quickly. You look at their efficiency numbers last year. Their offense and defense were both better than expected. Offensive line needs to take a step forward, but fortunately, they're returning 6 of their top 7 players in terms of snaps on the offensive line. I think with Addison Nichols coming in as a 4-star freshman, this unit will take a step forward. And then you bring back veteran Hendon Hooker. He has plenty of weapons in the receiving game. No Velus Jones or Javante Payton, but Cedric Tillman was amazing last year. He had a 27% target share. 2.5 yards per route run is in the elite category. He's close to like a Chris Olave there. And then they have players that can step up and fill the voids. Jimmy Callaway was a nice rotational player. I think he might challenge a guy like Brew McCoy, a former 5-star recruit who transfers in. Off the field issues with Brew McCoy, but if he can't actually get on the field, he appears to have the talent. Jalen Hyatt was another guy that played well when he was on the field in a limited capacity. And then you have veterans in the running back room like Jabari Small, Jalen Wright. Those are players that have been there for a while. And Tennessee returned 7 starters for a defense that was 62nd overall. This defense is probably going to take a step forward. They have a couple players they need to replace in the secondary, and like an Alante Taylor. But overall, I'm expecting the defense to take a step forward too. The problem is the win total's high, 7.5. It's probably a stay away for me, but I do think Tennessee is a team headed in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm high on Tennessee. I'm going to try to make a stand with them this year. I think it's because of the coaching staff. They're accelerating what I think would be a multi-year plan. I think they're ahead of schedule. And I'm not, they can't challenge Georgia, but they don't have to. To clear 8 wins here, or 7.5 rather, get 8 wins. I think they can do that even with some unfortunate scheduling at LSU and Bama from the West. The big game for me will be in their second game will be at Pittsburgh. I think they got to win that type of game. I think they should win that game. To me, I'm not super high on Pittsburgh this year. If they do that, Ball State and Akron are the other teams they play in non-con there. And then Tennessee Martin, that's 4 wins right there. The end of their schedule, home to Missouri, at South Carolina, and at Vanderbilt. Right there, you have potentially 6 or 7 wins. Then you got to steal 1, and there's a couple more gettable games. I'm high on Hendon Hooker. I think this is going to be an explosive offense. I'm going to call for Tennessee to be the second best team in the East this year.
I don't think that's crazy considering what we just talked about with Kentucky. There's a couple other teams I think could challenge, but I think Tennessee's right there.
If it's not them, the other team, again, kind of this mirrors LSU to me. The arch rival of Georgia in the East used to be Florida, and it was actually the other way around. Florida was on top, and Georgia was always trying to knock them off. Florida has regressed. 7 win total, over -125, under +105. I got a lot of questions for this team. To me, they're a difficult evaluation. We saw, they were running multiple quarterbacks, obviously dual threats. Where do the Gators stand heading into this season?
They're replacing their coaching staff, and they bring in Louisiana Lafayette coach Billy Napier. I'm not a big fan. I know he's had success, but I think there's a lot of questions in terms of him being able to evaluate the own talent on his roster. We've seen him just use 3 running backs regardless of who's there. At future NFL pick, now current NFLer, Elijah Mitchell was there, clearly better than the other options. Couldn't figure out how to play him in more than a 3-way rotation. You could say the same thing for some of the receivers. And he hired his boys, like Rob Sale. He's a guy that has at least a history with Louisiana Lafayette, former OC. Patrick Toney and Sean Spencer, these guys are other coaches that have history with Louisiana Lafayette. So to me, it's like you're not actually evaluating the coaching pool. You're just hiring your boys. That's a big issue. There's tons of issues with the roster. That's a team that was widely under recruiting in the previous regime. So now they're going to have to take a step forward with a weaker roster in terms of SEC production. Emory Jones leaves. So Anthony Richardson definitely is a breakout candidate at quarterback, but he was certainly up and down. Sub 60% completion, 6 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, only 6.5 yards per attempt. That's passing. Now, on the ground, he was amazing, 6'4", 236, elite athleticism. But he's going to be playing behind an offensive line that is returning 6 of their top 8 offensive linemen. The issue is they were just average at best. You do get Osiris Torrance coming in, who is amazing with Louisiana Lafayette. But again, he's taking a huge step up in competition from that Sun Belt schedule up to the SEC. So how does the offensive line look? Running back, again, you just bring in Montrell Johnson from Louisiana. He was a freshman last year, and he did rush for 838 yards, but he was right below average in terms of yards after contact and forced missed tackles per attempt. So I think there's a lot here, but a lot isn't being discussed in terms of efficiency with these players that we're actually underachieving. And the same thing goes for receivers. Like Justin Shorter is a firm bust at this point. Xavier Henderson, Trent Whittemore, both firmly below average in terms of yards per route run. Like, what are we doing with this offense? It's across the board below average, and I'm not sure how they're going to hang in there with some of the better offenses.
Well, we're going to find out pretty quickly because they are a 2.5-point dog right now in the opening game against Utah. That's a big game. They win that, that's going to go a long way. They lose that, it could set the stage for what I think could be a messy season. I wanted to ask you a little more. I know you talked about this briefly. Anthony Richardson, definitely a breakout candidate. I also think he's live to lose the job at some point.
For sure. If he plays poorly, Jack Miller transferred in, who's a former four-star for Ohio State. And we know Billy Napier is not making rational coaching decisions some of the time. Some of the time, I'm not going to say all the time because he has put up really good years before with Louisiana Lafayette. But again, that's in the Sun Belt. Now your coaching competitions like Josh Heupel and Kirby. Like, this is going to be a lot different for him. Their defense, I will say, I think is pretty good. I mean, I think they can try to ride their defense, play slower, create a volatile sort of situation for opponents. And their defense was really hurt last year. So when you look at their ranking 84th overall, I do think they're much better than that. They return a bit of production, 7 starters. So I think they'll try to ride the defense and the run game. It's just I'm not sure that's going to win against teams that can actually score.
Yeah, I mean, their season to me is going to come down to actually the bookends. Utah, and then they're at Florida State in that rivalry game. Those are the games that they're probably going to have to win if you're going over, if you're going under, and they lose those games. I think in the SEC, they perform as expected. I like Tennessee over them. I think Tennessee is a better team than Florida at this point, and they go to Tennessee. That's another huge game. So we'll find out. Just the last thing for me, this schedule, this is how they start. Utah, Kentucky, USF, and at Tennessee. You're going to find out pretty quickly how good Florida is. The season could be over through 4 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, the line has already moved 5 points in the Utah game. They were 2.5-point favorites. Now they're 2.5-point underdogs.
And I like Utah.
I hit Utah as a 2.5-point underdog immediately when the line came out.
That is
knowing this Florida team is a disaster.
Correct. Yeah, I'm going to be on the Utes as well. Okay.
And Florida State's better. We'll talk about them in a future episode. I don't think it's a complete shoe-in that they beat Florida State. And we'll talk why, but this isn't the Florida State of the last few years.
Jordan Travis season. Finally.
He was way better than people think.
I love that guy. I've been on him for whatever. That's a future episode. That's why, again.
Dude, he does the exact same things as Anthony Richardson. He's definitely not as big, but he's a run-centric quarterback. I think he's better than Anthony Richardson, which might be a hot take. We'll have to see how Anthony Richardson develops. But as the season starts, in the next few days, I have no problem ranking Travis ahead of Richardson.
I'm telling you, again, I'm going with some crazy hot takes in this episode. Jack Miller's getting starts this year, not because of injury. I really believe that. I think Florida could have some trouble, and with the new coaching staff, it's not going to be that just Richardson's job. I think he could get pulled if they struggle, if they're 1-3 after those 4 games or something like that.
I think it's possible too. Plus, I don't like their running backs.
No, I didn't like them last year. They had like 8 guys.
Yeah, and that was a staple of the previous regime. The problem is Billy Napier does the exact same thing.
Yeah. Elijah McGuire season. Anyway, South Carolina, they're another team that I think is actually on the right path, but not yet. I guess that's how I would describe them. And the books kind of agree. You have just a 6-win total, over at -125, under at 105. 150-1 the SEC. They're not relevant in that regard, but they bring in Rattler. They're changing some things up. Where do you think they fall in the hierarchy of the East?
I think, just like you said, I can't really say it any better. They're emerging, and I think we saw them start to emerge down the stretch last year. They won 7 games, which is pretty crazy for a team that had the talent that they have. They're certainly better, and I like Shane Beamer as a head coach. I like Satterfield as an OC. Even Clayton White, I think You can give him some praise on defense, but we knew it was going to take multiple years. They're a team that had been in the complete dumps, and now they're recruiting really well. They were 25th in the country in recruiting, 9th in transfers. The question is, can that manifest this year? I personally think, and it sounds like you agree, this might take a little bit of time, but they're recruiting really well. And even on top of Rattler, they bring in a 4-star quarterback this year in Tanner Bailey. He could be a great player for them down the road. Again, it's going to take some time. Fortunately, Rattler was a lot better than people think. He was the second highest graded quarterback in the Big 12 behind Caleb Williams last year. And funny, now Oklahoma has neither. But Rattler actually completed 75% of his passes, 8 yards per attempt. The big issue was turnovers. He had 5 interceptions, just 11 touchdowns. If he can cut back on those, I think it's going to be huge for them. And fortunately, they add a lot of weapons. Antwain Wells comes over from James Madison. His yards per route run was 2.85. That's the elite category. It appears he can make the jump up to the SEC. Again, James Madison kind of playing at a similar level of competition to some of the worst G5 teams. Corey Rucker comes over from Arkansas State. He's been productive. Josh Vann was very productive for this team, over 2 yards per route run. And even a guy like DeKirian Joyner, he can be used in a gadget role. Amari and Brown and Xavier Leggett, both bad, but they at least have experience. And then a huge breakout candidate is Jaheim Bell. This guy was amazing last year on a really small sample. 3.67 yards per route run. That's like the Brock Bowers territory. This guy was awesome, and now he needs to play a larger role in the offense. But when you have him as a complete breakout candidate, not to mention Austin Stogner coming over from Oklahoma, who's a career over 2 yards per route run guy, this is a really good offense with some solid weapons. It's just, can they hang in there with some teams? And I personally think they're starting to get closer, but I'm not sure they're quite there just yet.
Yep, that's how I feel. Certainly when your rival is Clemson, that doesn't help the scheduling. So they got to go there at the end of the year. It's fine. I think they're going to be a competitive team, not an easy win, not a rollover. Couple years. Give them a couple years, and you're going to see South Carolina back to relevance. Not going to take them here. If I did, even though I think they're on the right track, I have a feeling they could, land in the 4 or 5 range pretty often here.
Yeah, their non-con's not easy with Clemson. No. But overall, I think there's, and plus they're plus 1,500 to win the conference. They're going to be dogs in most of these games, even with the step forward. This team kind of reminds me of like an Arkansas last year or 2 years ago, where they brought in Briles and Pittman, and they were starting to get these high-profile recruits, and we're like, it's going to take a couple of years for Arkansas, and then they surprised, and I wouldn't be shocked if that happens this year. But I think ultimately the fruits of everything they're doing will benefit them in years to come rather than in 2022.
Yep. So a wait and see candidate, maybe definitely a team that maybe look to betting in certain spots, just not before the season. I don't know where Missouri falls. I can't even say that they're doing anything. 5.5 win total. Under is minus 135. I'll be honest. I know they profile in a similar category as South Carolina, but to me, the trajectory of these programs is different. I'm high on what South Carolina is doing. I don't know what Missouri is doing. I'll be honest. I have no grasp of what they're doing. Is it as messy as it looks, or are there some positives that they can take into the season?
I think they parallel South Carolina in a lot of ways. I like their head coach, Elijah Drinkwitz. He's recruiting really well. This team is 15th in recruiting, 21st in the transfer portal. Just they had a ton of questions still. The quarterback position being the main question here. They have no clear starter between Brady Cook and Tyler Macon. And they did recruit a 4-star Sam Horn, but he's going to get drafted in the MLB. And there's a strong chance he just opts to play baseball over football. He wasn't with the program this spring. So I think just Sam Horn being a complete question mark and really the only decent recruit this program has at quarterback, you could be looking at another year before some of these recruits really pay off. They do have the number 1 wide receiver in the country in Luther Burden. He should play immediately because all the receivers in this offense were pretty bad. Tusky Dove should be the 2, but from there, everyone was just horrific. Bannister, Lovett, Looper, Mookie Cooper, all really bad players. So I think Luther Burden comes in from day 1 and is the wide receiver 1. Whoever starts at quarterback should have a very friendly option there. But the offensive line, they're, I guess, a program that's pretty decent overall. I like what they have. So I think they could have maybe just fall back on the run like they did last year with Beatty. Hopefully they don't get down in games immediately, but they can certainly ride Stanford transfer Nathaniel Pete. He was well above average in terms of yards after contact and forced missed tackles. And they have another 4-star coming in Tavorius Jones. So I do think their defense is a team, or is like a unit that could need a little bit of help. 8 returning starters, basically all of whom are below average. So I question if they'll be able to actually use that game plan where they can ride the offensive line and the run with such a bad defense. And then just the quarterback being so bad or such a big question mark. Shootout seemed like a big question for this team as well.
Yeah, first of all, I don't know how they got that recruit. Is he like a St. Louis kid or something? How do they keep this guy?
He is local. I think he's from Illinois, but obviously close to St. Louis.
Yeah.
He's from that area.
That helps. They better go 4-0 in non-con, and they have a chance, but they do have to go to Manhattan to play Kansas State. I think this team might win one game in the SEC. I think they're live to do that. They could beat Vanderbilt. Every other game, I think there's a potential that they're dogs. Looking at the schedule, actually, I'm pretty confident that they will be underdog in every SEC game except the Vanderbilt game.
Yeah, if the season started today, they would be.
Yeah, that's a tough ask for me. When there's that many games that you're going to have to, overachieve. And if you lose to Kansas State and even if you're 3-1 in non-con, I don't think it's enough to get 3 SEC wins.
I agree with you. And again, similar to South Carolina, I think they're going to be better, but I think they have a longer path to get there just because their quarterback situation is so unsettled. Like there's a stark difference between bringing in Rattler and a 4-star, between returning Brady Cook, Tyler Macon, and then having your 4-star maybe like playing baseball. Like if he gets drafted in the MLB and opts to pursue that, he won't even be with the team.
Yeah, I don't think it's the best situation. We'll keep an eye on them, but I would go under. All right, we got one team left. Then we'll give our best bets and we'll bounce on out of here at Betting You. But I know this is what people are waiting for. For $100, if you bet Vanderbilt to win the SEC, you get back $100,000. Easy enough. The problem is there's really nothing that could happen where that could happen. 2.5 is their win total. Over is plus money. My God, is it that bad for this team, or are the books saying, a little too aggressive that Vanderbilt is live to only win a game or two?
I think they are too aggressive in saying that. Like this team is easily the worst in the SEC, but people forget, looking at even this year, and you can look over the last couple of years, Vanderbilt's not that bad in terms of recruiting and transfers. They're 32nd in the country in recruiting this year, 59th in transfers, 47th overall in composite. Like Vanderbilt is not that bad of a team, and their non-con isn't the most difficult. I think you look at 3 winnable games. Hawaii is horrific. We'll talk about them in a future episode, but they lost essentially all their good players. Elon and Northern Illinois from the MAC. I think that is probably a pick'em type game with plus money towards the over. I think this whole win total essentially rides on the Northern Illinois game. And Vanderbilt probably should be maybe a slight dog to a pick'em in that game. If they win it, you're cashing a win total 3 games into the year. So it doesn't even really matter to me what happens as much in the SEC with this team. And I personally think they're live to beat a Missouri. So to me, over 2.5 at plus money is a pretty strong bet. And I didn't think I'd be saying that with Vandy.
We talked about this last year with South Dakota and Kansas in that opening game. It was just like, if Kansas can win that game, you're going to be looking at basically needing to win one game the entire year. And ultimately, Kansas turned out to be a little better. You definitely need, I think you would agree, you definitely need to either have cashed this through week 4 or have 2 wins, and then you have an outside chance. There's no way, to me, barring something, that Vanderbilt, you can peg them to win 2 SEC games. I think they could steal 1, but you have to be at worst 2-2 in the 4 non-con games.
I agree with you. There are concerns with Vanderbilt, of course. If you want to actually talk the roster, quarterback's a concern. I like that they have returning starters. I think Mike Wright is decent. He needs to cut back on the turnovers, but I like that he can run. They have the number 25 quarterback in this class in AJ Swan, which is a pretty dang good recruit for Vandy. If Swan ends up needing to play, it's a guy that actually has pretty decent recruiting numbers. And at receiver, I think you have a legit starter in Will Shepard, and then you have 2 pretty highly recruited 3-stars that are like on the verge of 4, and Jaden McGowan and Davon Walker. I think both might need to play this year. And then Ben Breschanen, he's a returning starter at tight end. Maybe the biggest concern is O-line. You're losing 3 starters. None of them were very good, though. So this could be sort of an addition by subtraction. Their returning starters are decent, especially like a Bradley Ashmore and a Delphin Xavier Castillo. They had a North Texas transfer and former starter Jacob Brammer. So the offensive line might be a little better. And they actually returned 7 starters on defense. And this is a team, again, that we were talking about needing time because, like Kansas, you're recruiting at a decent level. Vandy definitely recruits better than Kansas, 32nd again this year. But those are freshmen. They need time to kind of coalesce and develop. I think that could happen this year. I mean, like, they have two four-star players. Like, this team recruits better than a lot of Power 5 schools. They're definitely recruiting better than, like, in Iowa State. And that's pretty difficult to say and tough to admit, but I think this team's better than 2.5 wins.
Well, again, we're going to find out very quickly because to me, their most likely wins are weeks 1 and 2. Hawaii is garbage. They almost had a no program because there was Todd Graham riot. And then Elon is not a real place. So I've been to that campus. Nice campus, but I don't think they're very good at football. So if they can get those now, just the last thing, and then we'll get to our final bets. I say those are games you got to win. It's worth noting that ETSU absolutely smoked Vandy last year. So it's not a gimme that they just beat those type of teams. And if they don't, you have no chance to cash it.
And then Vandy beat Colorado State.
Yes. It just shows, though, there's variance with these teams. Like, the talent in Vandy is good enough to win games. They're not a pushover, but it's also a team that could lose to pretty much anyone.
That is true. East Tennessee State wasn't that bad.
The Buccaneers. I bet
they had some decent up transfers.
Should have been in the college basketball. Oh, anyway, that's another show when March Madness rolls around. All right, we've talked about every SEC schools. We've given you our bets, but let's do a quick recap before we bounce on out of here. And again, make sure to get over to BetMGM and take advantage of that money. And make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss any of these shows. Favorite bets in terms of the win totals. Give me your favorite couple.
All right, there's 5 I already took. Mississippi State under 6.5. That's sitting at plus money, plus 105. I think the win total is actually correct, but if you're going to give me plus money on one side, I'll take under for a Mississippi State team that should be regressing a little bit negatively. Auburn under 6.5. That's minus 160, but I legit think they're favored in just 4 games this year. So even though you have to lay some juice, I think that's one you should be taking. And if it moves to 6 or 5.5, still willing to take it. Over Vanderbilt 2.5, we just discussed this, so I won't really discuss at length. I think it comes down to 3 of their 4 non-conference games, and probably if they can beat Northern Illinois. It's plus 120, though, so I think that's a decent bet. Missouri under 5.5, minus 135. The quarterback is the seller for me. It's going to be a tough schedule for them. Even in the East, they're projected to be the second worst team. They're behind only Vandy, and I'm not entirely sure they beat Vandy based on their recruiting numbers. And last one, Florida under 7. I think 7's an inflated number based on name recognition of the program. Not a fan of their coaching staff coming in. They actually play a decently difficult schedule, particularly in non-con, and they have a lot of big questions, particularly on offense with quarterback and some of the poor receiving production they've posted in the past without any real replacements there. So that's also plus money, plus 105, under 7.0 wins for Florida. Also have some push equity. Those are my 5 favorite.
I'm going to add in just a couple more. If you don't mind locking, if you have a lot of money, you don't mind locking some up. I truly think that Georgia's getting to 11 or more wins almost in all the scenarios. I think even though you're laying north of minus 200, it's a very, very safe spot there. I just don't see them losing 2 games in any scenario. And I am high on Tennessee. I can get there. I would not like it at minus 160. I think that's a little much. If you can find that in a better range, I think they should win 8 games, and I think they will win 8 games. I'm not going to lay minus 160, but I wanted to point those 2 out. I'm with you on yours. This was a fun conference. We're going to be doing this for each conference, finding those. This is where the money can be made. Some of these win totals are just off. Auburn, to me, is the best bet on the board. I don't understand how they're getting to 7 wins. So I am with you on that. But for me, for Matt, for everyone here at Odd Shopper, this was a good, fun episode. I had a blast doing this. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, they can follow you where? At Matt_Gajewski, correct?
That is it.
That is it. At JazzRazDFS here. Hit us in that comments. Let us know which team are we too high on, too low on, or just right. We will be back next week. Same time, same place, breaking down another conference here at Betting You. Talk to you guys then.